The greatest sound in sports is not a roar. It is the silence that follows it. That collective intake of breath from 70,000 souls held in suspension, finally released in a seismic wave of pure, unthinking noise. It is a sound that vibrates in your chest, that you feel in your teeth. It is the sound of glory. We pay for that sound. We crave it. We build our Sundays around it. But there is another silence, a deeper, more permanent one. It is the silence that waits for the man who created that roar. It finds him not in the stadium, but in the quiet of a suburban kitchen 20 years later. It is the silence of a mind that can no longer track the conversation at the dinner table. It is the silence of a body that hums with a pain so constant it has become its own kind of white noise. It is the silence of a name, once chanted by millions, now struggling to recall its own. This is the story of that silence, and the long, brutal, and legally seismic war that was fought when that silence was finally broken. I want you to picture a man. Let's call him John. In 1979, John was a god. Not a metaphor, a literal god in the eyes of a city. He was a linebacker, the heart of a dynasty, a figure carved from granite and fury. His photograph from that era shows a being of pure will, eyes locked in a predator's gaze, neck thicker than his helmeted head, forearms like cured hams. He was a symbol of invincibility. The film from his playing days is a study in controlled violence. You see him diagnose a play, explode through the gap, meet the running back in the hole with a concussive thud that seems to ripple through the very film grain. The crowd sound rises. He pops up, taps his helmet, trots back to the huddle. The machine resets. This happened hundreds, thousands of times. Each collision a deposit into the bank of glory. Each one also a withdrawal from an account he didn't know he had. The account of his future self. Now picture John today. The granite has softened, shifted. The body that was a temple is now a museum of old wars. The knees are shot, the shoulders grown. But that is not the real injury. The real injury is behind his eyes. I sat with him in his living room, a room filled with the artifacts of his divinity. Gleaming trophies, framed jerseys, a ring the size of a knuckle. He was trying to tell me a story about his grandson's birthday party. The kids were running around, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. And they had this cake. It was shaped like a... He stopped. The word was gone. His eyes, once so fiercely focused, darted around the room, searching the air for the noun. A dinosaur, his wife said softly from the kitchen doorway, not looking up from wiping a counter. A flicker of frustration, then shame, passed over his face. A dinosaur, he repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. He looked at me, and for a moment the predator was back, but now he was cornered. I knew that, he said, a defensive edge in his voice. It gets crowded in here sometimes. He tapped his temple with a thick finger. Crowded. What a gentle word for the civil war raging inside his skull. This is the final season. The one that never ends. The one with no schedule, no cheerleaders, no highlights. It is the season of forgetting anniversaries. Of getting lost driving to the grocery store you visited for a decade. It is the season of irrational anger that frightens your grandchildren. Of a headache that never, ever lifts. It is the season where the man who once memorized hundreds of complex defensive audibles now struggles to follow the plot of a sitcom. This is what glory decomposes into. Not a graceful retirement, but a slow, eroding fade. And for decades, this fate was treated as a tragic, but isolated, mystery. A sad postscript to a heroic tale. The league's attitude was a paternalistic shrug. Some men get old. Some men get unlucky. It's a tough game. But what if it wasn't unlucky? What if it was inevitable? What if the very thing we celebrated, the spectacular, brain-rattling hit, was a slow-acting poison? And what if the architects of the game, the stewards of these men, knew more about that poison than they ever let on? This is where our story transforms from a series of individual tragedies into a collective conspiracy. This is where the silence was pierced not by a scream, but by the cold, precise language of a legal filing. The lawsuit was officially known as National Football League players' concussion injury litigation. A dry, procedural mouthful, but in reality it was a declaration of war. It was the moment the players, those scattered, broken, and silent veterans, finally formed a phalanx. They were no longer just former athletes. They were plaintiffs. And they were not suing for more money, not really. They were suing for truth. They were suing for acknowledgement. The core accusation was as simple as it was damning. That the NFL, for decades, had knowingly and deliberately concealed the links between football and permanent brain damage. That it had used its immense power to fund flawed science, to discredit independent researchers, to create a culture that treated concussions as a sign of weakness rather than a medical emergency. That it had, in essence, fed its own players a curated lie to keep the machine running. Imagine that. Imagine you worked for a company that asked you, as part of your job, to hit your head against a wall repeatedly. The company's doctors told you it was safe. The company's executives built a PR campaign around the virtue of head hitting. They sold millions of tickets to people who cheered your head-hitting prowess. They made billions of dollars from your ability to hit your head. Then, decades later, you discover internal memos from that company's own research division, dating back years, that said, in clear language, hitting your head against a wall causes permanent brain damage. What would you call that? The NFL concussion lawsuit was not a mere legal dispute over liability. It was a rupture in the narrative. The NFL had spent the better part of a century selling America a perfect myth of courage, of resilience, of Sunday sacrifice for team and town. It sold violence as virtue. The lawsuit pulled back the curtain on the factory floor. It revealed the myth as a product, and a dangerous one at that. It asked the uncomfortable question: is this sport, as currently constructed, compatible with human health? And in doing so, it threatened not just the league's finances, but its very soul. The plaintiffs weren't just seeking a settlement. They were putting the game itself on trial. This is the journey we are about to take. It begins not in a courtroom, but in the morgues and forgotten locker rooms where the evidence was piling up, ignored. It wins through the league's Park Avenue offices where decisions were made in plush silence. It explodes into the public consciousness through the tears of widows and the foggy testimonies of broken heroes. It is a story of science versus denial, of memory versus forgetting, of a brotherhood of warriors turning their weapons on the kings who sent them to battle. It is the story of how a group of broken men, armed only with their pain and a handful of courageous lawyers, took on the most powerful sports empire on earth and very nearly broke it. This is the story of the silence and the earthquake that began when it finally spoke. They are now scattered across the country, living with the consequences. They are not a monolith. Some are angry, feeling betrayed. Some are confused, their memories too fragmented to assemble a coherent grievance. Some are just deeply, profoundly tired. Their leader was not a person, but a condition. The creeping fog of dementia, the unpredictable eruptions of rage, the aching loneliness of a mind divorcing from itself. They sought more than money, a simple acknowledgement. Asterisk, what happened to me was not bad luck. It was the predictable result of my job. Asterisk. Standing opposed was the second faction. The league. The National Football League is not a sports league in any traditional sense. It is a cartel, a monopoly, a cultural and financial fortress. Its headquarters on Park Avenue is a temple of power. For decades, its response to any external threat, from rival leagues to labor disputes, was a unified, implacable front. On the issue of brain trauma, its strategy was a masterpiece of corporate defense. Deny, dismiss, and discredit. It created its own research committee, stocked it with doctors who delivered favorable findings, and used that internal science as a shield against the growing whispers from the independent medical community. That independent community forms our third faction, the scientists. They were neurologists, neuropathologists, and neuropsychologists, often working with shoestring budgets. They were voices in the wilderness, armed with autopsy slides and cognitive tests, trying to shout over the entertainment juggernaut. People like Dr. Bennett Omalu, the forensic pathologist who would put a name to the disease, and Dr. Ian McKee, the neuropathologist whose brain bank would become the irrefutable archive of damage. They were motivated by medical curiosity and a growing sense of horror. They were not anti-football. They were pro-truth, and they found themselves in the crosshairs of the most powerful sports entity on the planet. Bridging the gap between the broken players and the arcane world of tort law was our fourth faction, the lawyers. These were not sports agents. They were class-action litigators, plaintiffs' attorneys who specialized in taking on corporations. They saw in the scattered, ailing former players not just clients, but the key to a narrative that could sway a jury. Men like Thomas Girardi, the flamboyant California attorney, and Sol Weiss and Christopher Seeger, the more methodical East Coast partners, who would eventually consolidate thousands of individual claims into a single historic class action suit. They were the unlikely avengers, translating personal tragedy into legal cause of action. The journey we will trace is one of collision. It begins in the early 2000s with the first isolated lawsuits, a trickle of grief and anger. We will see how the 2002 suicide of Hall of Fame Pittsburgh Steeler Mike Webster and the subsequent autopsy findings became the catalyst that turned a trickle into a flood. We will walk through the league's aggressive public relations counteroffensive, a campaign that labeled concerned scientists as outsiders and zealots. We will enter the brutal, revelatory process of legal discovery, where the plaintiff's attorneys pried loose internal NFL memos and emails that would form the heart of their case. Documents that suggested the league knew more than it ever admitted. We will witness the public relations war, fought on the pages of newspapers and in congressional hearing rooms, where the league's facade of infallibility began to crack under the weight of player testimony and damning science. We will analyze the high-stakes negotiation that led to the unprecedented, nearly $1 billion settlement, a figure that stunned the world but left many players and families feeling that true justice, an admission of guilt, had been bargained away. And we will follow the agonizing aftermath, as the settlement's complex claims process created a new layer of bureaucracy and battle for the very men it was designed to help. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no victor holding a trophy. There is, instead, a fractured landscape. The game continues, richer and more popular than ever, even as its foundational violence is now an acknowledged, if managed, danger. The players of today play with more information, but they still play the same game, making a calculated bet with their neurological futures. The settlement money flows, a tardy compensation for ruined lives, but the moral victory is ambiguous. The lawsuit did not kill the NFL. It did not even truly reform it. What it did was something perhaps more profound. It stripped away the mythology and forced us to see the league as what it always was, a business. A business that made an existential calculation that the men were expendable, and the game was not. This is the story of how that calculation was dragged into the light, and how the silence of thousands of broken men finally found its voice in the cold language of the law. The American century had a soundtrack. It was the crackle of a radio broadcasting a Roosevelt fireside chat, the static-laden cry of the Giants win the pennant, the twang of a country song on a pickup truck radio. But by the 1960s, a new, dominant rhythm emerged. The violent, orchestrated chaos of professional football, perfectly packaged for the television age. The NFL didn't just grow. It executed a hostile takeover of the national consciousness. It fused athleticism with warfare, individual genius with tribal loyalty. It gave us mythic figures in silver and blue, in green and gold, in black and silver. It sold us an idea that through sheer will and sacrifice, a man could transcend his limits. What it did not sell us was the cost of that transcendence. This documentary is about the bill that eventually came due, and the earth-shattering legal battle that forced the nation to read the fine print. The thesis is this: the NFL concussion lawsuit, culminating in the 2013 settlement, was the moment the stadium lights turned violently inward. For decades, those lights had illuminated only the spectacle, the soaring pass, the brutal tackle, the triumphant raise of the Lombardi Trophy. They cast the players as glorious, two-dimensional figures. The lawsuit swung those same Klieg lights onto the league itself, exposing the machinery in the shadows. It revealed a decades-long systemic prioritization of profit, product, and narrative over the long-term safety of the men who generated all three. This was not an accident of a violent game. The evidence suggests a conscious business strategy. The League understood that the product was the violence. To admit that the violence was inherently destructive to the human mind was to admit that the product itself was poison. So they managed the truth as carefully as they managed the salary cap. To understand the magnitude of this concealment, you must first understand the culture the NFL built. From the gravel-voiced tirades of coaches like Vince Lombardi, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all," to the Hollywood glamorized brutality of the 1970s Oakland Raiders, the League cultivated a cult of toughness. Pain was not an obstacle. It was a rite of passage. Returning to the field with a ding or a stinger was the ultimate badge of honor. The language itself was a sanitizing tool. A concussion wasn't a traumatic brain injury. It was getting your bell rung. You didn't lose consciousness. You saw stars. This lexicon was passed down like a sacred text. Former Colt and Hall of Famer Johnny Unitas once quipped, "I've had a couple concussions. Who hasn't? You just spit out your teeth and go back in." It was a joke that contained a deadly serious commandment. The game is greater than you. While this culture was being codified on the field, a parallel, quieter story was unfolding in medical journals and lonely laboratories. As far back as the 1920s, the term punch drunk was used to describe boxers with slurred speech and shaky movements. By the 1970s, a few pioneering researchers began to ask uncomfortable questions about football. Dr. Ira Kassan, who would later become the controversial co-chair of the NFL's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, co-authored a paper in 1979 that included a prescient line, "The syndrome of chronic progressive brain damage due to boxing is well known. A similar syndrome may occur after repeated cerebral concussions in other sports, such as football." The evidence was whispering, but the NFL's roar was deafening. Our story is driven by four factions, each orbiting the central truth of brain trauma, each with a radically different relationship to it. First, the players, not the current stars, but the forgotten men, the ones for whom the cheering stopped 20, 30, 40 years ago. Before the lawsuits, before the congressional hearings, before the billion-dollar settlement, there was a man living in a truck. This was not just any man. This was Mike Webster. Iron Mike, the anchor of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty of the 1970s. A center who started 177 consecutive games. A Hall of Famer whose toughness was the stuff of NFL legend. His biography was the league's preferred narrative. A small-town kid who through grit and talent ascended to the pinnacle of the sport, winning 4 Super Bowl rings. His postscript, however, was the story the league did not want you to hear. It was the canary in the coal mine, a silent, suffering warning of a poison in the air. Webster's descent was not a sudden fall, but a slow, agonizing unraveling. His retirement after the 1990 season did not mark an end, but the beginning of a different, more brutal contest. The man who could recall every blocking scheme of his 15-year career found he could no longer manage his finances. The disciplined athlete became plagued by chronic pain, depression, and a volatile, unpredictable anger. He suffered from amnesia, sometimes forgetting where he was. He would taste himself to sleep, using the electrical shock to short-circuit his crippling pain and insomnia. Once celebrated for his strength, he became a ghost haunting the periphery of the game he helped define. He lived out of his pickup truck, sleeping in train stations, his Hall of Fame ring stored in a cheap motel safe. He underwent a series of desperate, futile medical procedures, including having screws implanted in his back that he would later try to remove himself with a pair of pliers. In 2002, at the age of 50, Mike Webster died of a heart attack. His body was found in a Pittsburgh hospital room, where he had gone seeking help. To the public, it was a sad, messy end for a football hero. To a forensic pathologist in the Allegheny County Coroner's office, it was a medical mystery begging to be solved. Dr. Bennett Omalu was not a football fan. He was a Nigerian-born forensic pathologist, a man of deep faith and scientific rigor, who believed the dead had stories to tell that the living needed to hear. Puzzled by the disparity between Webster's physical strength and his cognitive collapse, he sought and received permission from the family to study Webster's brain. What he found would change the conversation around football forever, though not without a fierce fight. Under his microscope, Omalu saw a brain that looked nothing like that of a healthy 50-year-old man. It was scarred. It was atrophied. Most tellingly, it was marred by a strange, brownish tangling of a protein called tau. This tau protein had formed clumps that choked off the neurons, disrupting the brain's ability to transmit information. It was a pathology Omalu recognized from the literature on boxers, where it was called dementia pugilistica. But this was a football player. Omalu, along with colleagues including neuroscientist Dr. Ron Hamilton, gave it a new name, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. In 2005, Omalu published his findings in the journal Neurosurgery in a paper titled Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy in a National Football League Player. It was a dry, clinical account, but its implications were explosive. It proposed a direct causal link between the repeated head trauma inherent in professional football and a progressive, degenerative brain disease. This was the smoking gun. The NFL's response was immediate and aggressive. It was not a request for more research. It was not an expression of concern. It was a coordinated assault on Omalu's credentials, his methods, and his motives. The league's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, led by Dr. Ira Kassan and Dr. Elliot Pellman, wrote a formal letter to the journal demanding a retraction. They dismissed Omalu's work as completely wrong, flawed, and a misunderstanding of the data. They argued that a single case study proved nothing. The pressure was immense. Omalu, an outsider to both football and the American medical establishment, described feeling bullied and intimidated. The league's strategy was clear. Discredit the messenger and you discredit the message. Kill the First Canary and pretend the air is safe. But Mike Webster was not alone. Even as the NFL tried to bury Omalu's findings, other stories were surfacing, eerie echoes of Webster's nightmare. There was Terry Long, Webster's former Steelers teammate, who drank antifreeze and died in 2005. There was Justin Strzelczyk, another Steelers offensive lineman, who died in a high-speed, wrong-way police chase in 2004. Suffering from paranoia and delusions. There was Andre Waters, the ferocious Philadelphia Eagles safety known as Dirty Waters, who shot himself in the head in 2006 at age 44, after struggling with depression and erratic behavior. And there was Tom McHale, a Tampa Bay Buccaneers lineman who died of a drug overdose in 2008, his family noting his profound personality changes. These were not isolated incidents of personal failing. They were dots scattered across a map, and a pattern was beginning to emerge for anyone willing to connect them. The players shared a profile. They were often linemen, linebackers, or defensive backs, positions involving repeated subconcussive collisions. They retired, and within a decade or two, their lives spiraled into chaos marked by cognitive decline, mood disorders, and often early death. While the NFL dismissed Omalu, a few journalists and a handful of plaintiffs' attorneys began to listen. The family of Andre Waters sent his brain to Omalu, who confirmed the same tau pathology, the same CTE. A story by Alan Schwartz in the New York Times in 2007 brought Waters' case and Omalu's work to a national audience, applying mainstream pressure the league could not as easily ignore. Meanwhile, in courtrooms and law offices, a different kind of connection was being made. The widows and families of these men were not thinking about tau protein. They were thinking about injustice. They were thinking about the vibrant men they had lost, and the league that celebrated their violence but abandoned them in its aftermath. A lawyer would read about Webster, then be contacted by the family of Justin Strzelczyk. Another would see the Waters story and think of a client, a former player showing early signs of dementia. The dots were being connected not just by scientists, but by grief and by a dawning sense of systemic betrayal. These early, tentative legal inquiries were fragile things. They were individual malpractice suits against team doctors or workers' compensation claims filed in various states. They were often defeated by the league's legal fortress or settled quietly with strict confidentiality agreements. The players themselves were poor plaintiffs. Many were cognitively impaired, their memories unreliable. The league argued their conditions could be attributed to aging, genetics, drug use, or simply the wear and tear of life. The science, while compelling to Omalu and a few others, was not yet a solidified wall. It was a single brick. But each new tragedy, each new brain examined, was another brick. and the wall was growing. The story was shifting from "What's wrong with Mike Webster?" to "What is happening to all of them?" The death of Mike Webster and the discovery of CTE in his brain provided something crucial, a biological basis for the suffering. It transformed anecdotal tragedy into forensic evidence. It gave a name to the enemy. No longer was it just getting old or going crazy. It was a disease that could be seen, measured, and most importantly, linked to a specific cause. The league's attempt to crush Omalu's work had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the warning, they amplified it. They turned a medical case study into a cause. Mike Webster, the ultimate company man who gave his body and mind to the Steelers and the NFL, had in death become the foundation for the league's greatest existential threat. His broken brain was the first piece of evidence entered into a trial that would eventually encompass thousands of men and accuse the NFL of the ultimate betrayal. Knowing the danger and looking the other way, the Canary had died, and now people were finally starting to ask what was poisoning the mine. The story of the lawsuit is not just a story of broken players and a defensive league. It is also the story of the bridge between them, the lawyers. These were not the slick sports agents who negotiated contracts. They were a different breed entirely. Plaintiffs' attorneys, class action specialists, tort lawyers. Men who made their living by taking on corporations, pharmaceutical giants, tobacco companies, asbestos manufacturers, on behalf of large groups of injured people. They spoke the language of negligence, product liability, and fraudulent concealment. And when they looked at the growing pile of evidence surrounding Mike Webster, Terry Long, Andre Waters, and others, they did not just see tragic athletes. They saw a plaintiff class. They saw the architecture of a profound injustice, and they began to draw up the blueprints for a legal assault on the most powerful sports entity in the world. The challenge was, by any measure, absurd. The NFL was a fortress. It had limitless financial resources, a battalion of the most expensive defense lawyers in the country, decades of favorable public sentiment, and a product so deeply woven into the fabric of American culture that challenging it seemed almost unpatriotic. Individual players had tried to sue before, with claims about specific injuries or malpractice, and they had been swatted away, worn down, or settled into silence. The league's strategy was divide and conquer. To take them on, the plaintiffs' attorneys needed to unite the scattered, ailing, and often mistrustful former players into a single, powerful army. They needed a weapon equal to the NFL's monolithic power. That weapon was the class action lawsuit. The key architects emerged from different legal worlds. In California, there was Thomas Girardi of the famed firm Girardi and Keys, a flamboyant and theatrical litigator straight out of Central Casting, known for his victories in high-profile environmental and product liability cases. On the East Coast, there was a more methodical partnership, Sol Weiss and Christopher Seeger. Weiss, of the Philadelphia firm Anapol Weiss, was a seasoned mass tort lawyer with a reputation for relentless preparation. Seeger, of Seeger Weiss LLP in New York, brought a strategic mind honed in complex pharmaceutical litigation. They were joined by others, like Larry Coben of Arizona, who had already been representing individual players in concussion-related suits. These men were competitors used to battling each other for clients and leadership roles in big cases. But they understood that against the NFL, fragmentation meant defeat. Their first crucial move was to stop fighting each other and start collaborating. They formed a loose consortium, sharing information, pooling resources, and coordinating strategy. Their goal was to find every former player suffering from cognitive issues and bring them under one legal banner. The strategy hinged on the allegation of fraudulent concealment. This was the legal linchpin. They were not merely arguing that football was dangerous. Any player who stepped on the field assumed that risk. They were arguing something far more damning, that the NFL, through its own internal research and its hand-picked mild traumatic brain injury committee, had discovered specific, credible evidence linking repeated head trauma to long-term cognitive damage and had actively concealed that evidence from the players. They alleged the league had constructed a public facade of safety, promoting flawed science and dismissing independent research, all to keep players on the field and the profits flowing. This transformed the case from a simple personal injury claim into an allegation of corporate deceit. It was not that the players got hurt. It was that they were deliberately kept in the dark about the true nature of the danger. On July 19, 2011, the first major consolidated complaint was filed in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The language was not that of sports journalism. It was the cold, precise, and devastating language of the law. It named 75 former players as plaintiffs, representing all former NFL players who have suffered or will suffer from neurological injuries caused by repetitive traumatic brain injuries. The complaint laid out the accusation in stark terms. For decades, defendants have known that multiple blows to the head can lead to long-term brain injury, including memory loss, dementia, depression, and CTE. Despite this knowledge, and without warning the players, the defendants deliberately ignored and actively concealed the risks of repeated traumatic brain injuries. It accused the NFL of negligence, of fraud, of creating a public fraud by downplaying the risks. This document was the declaration of war. It consolidated dozens of smaller suits into one massive legal action, creating a single targetable front against the league. The NFL's initial reaction was a masterpiece of dismissive confidence. Their public statements were curt and unequivocal. The claims were meritless. The lawsuit was a lawyer-driven search for a solvent defendant. They argued, as they had for years, that player safety had always been a priority, that they had relied on the best available science, and that the players' conditions could be attributed to a host of other factors. Behind the scenes, they assembled a legal dream team, lawyers who had defended Wall Street banks and Fortune 100 companies. Their strategy was predictable: delay, deny, and drive up the cost of litigation until the plaintiffs' lawyers, who were fronting millions in expenses, bled out. They filed motions to dismiss, arguing the case belonged not in court but in arbitration under the league's collective bargaining agreement, a venue they controlled. They projected an aura of invincibility, believing the sheer weight of their resources would crush this challenge as it had crushed others. Among the players, the reaction was a turbulent mix of desperate hope and deep-seated fear. For men like the family of Mike Webster, who had felt abandoned and gaslit by the league, the lawsuit was a long-overdue chance for vindication. For others, suffering in quiet isolation with dementia or depression, it was a lifeline, a promise that their confusion and pain might have a reason, and a source of potential help for their families. But the fear was palpable. This was the NFL, the same league that blackballed players for speaking out on labor issues. Many former players, even those struggling, were terrified of retribution. Would they be excommunicated from the brotherhood? Would their pensions be affected? Would they be labeled as weak or greedy by the fans and the media? The culture of toughness the league had instilled in them now worked against the lawsuit. To come forward was to admit you were broken, to betray the code of silence. The attorneys had to not only build a legal case, but also build trust with a population conditioned for decades to distrust outsiders and to suffer in stoic silence. The early days were a precarious balancing act. The plaintiffs' lawyers were spending vast sums on medical experts, actuarial studies to project future costs, and the immense logistical task of locating and interviewing potential class members. They were gambling everything on a case with no guarantee of success. The NFL's motions to dismiss loomed like a guillotine. If the judge agreed the case belonged in arbitration under the labor agreement, the whole edifice could collapse before it was even built. The lawsuit existed in a tense limbo. It was a massive, threatening cloud on the league's horizon, but one they believed their legal artillery could scatter. The players were a fragmented group, united only by a shared suffering and a fragile hope. The scientists had the evidence, but not the platform. The case was built, but its foundation was about to be tested not in the court of public opinion, but in the quiet, procedural crucible of a federal courtroom. The opening salvos had been fired. Now, the real battle for the future of the game, and for the legacy of thousands who played it, would begin in earnest. The battlefield shifted from the public spectacle of the game to the sterile, procedural arena of the federal judiciary. The NFL's opening gambit was not a defense on the merits of the case, but a move to ensure the case would never be heard at all. Their legal team, a consortium of the nation's most formidable defense firms, filed a motion to dismiss. Their argument was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effect. This was not a matter for a court of law. The players' complaints, they contended, were fundamentally a dispute about workplace safety. And workplace safety for unionized employees was a matter governed by the collective bargaining agreement between the NFL and the players' union. Therefore, the only proper venue for these claims was not a federal courtroom, but the private arbitration system established by that CBA, a system heavily influenced, if not controlled, by the league itself. It was the legal equivalent of moving the fight from a neutral boxing ring into the NFL's own basement. If successful, the motion would not just delay the lawsuit, it would dissolve it, sending the players back to a labyrinthine, league-friendly process where their claims would likely die a quiet death. This was the first critical test for the nascent plaintiffs' consortium. They had built a case alleging fraud and concealment, but the NFL was arguing that the building itself was constructed on the wrong plot of land. The plaintiffs' attorneys countered with a nuanced but crucial distinction. Yes, they argued the general risk of injury was part of the bargain for exchange between the union and the league. But fraudulent concealment was something else entirely. That was not a workplace hazard. It was a tort, a civil wrong that existed independently of the labor contract. The NFL, they claimed, had a duty to the players not as employees under a CBA, but as human beings to whom they owed a basic standard of care and honesty. By hiding critical health information, the league had stepped outside the bounds of the labor agreement and into the realm of common law deceit. The fate of the entire endeavor now rested on whether a single judge would see it their way. The judge was Anita B. Brody of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. A Reagan appointee with a reputation for careful deliberation and a no-nonsense demeanor, she was now the unlikely gatekeeper to the most significant litigation in sports history. The hearing on the motion to dismiss was a study in contrasts. The NFL's lawyers presented a polished, almost academic argument, framing the case as a simple matter of jurisdictional overreach. The plaintiffs' attorneys, led by Sol Weiss and Christopher Seeger, argued with a more passionate urgency, painting a picture of a league that had operated a decades-long campaign of deception that transcended any labor negotiation. The league's position was clean, logical, and rooted in established labor law precedent. The plaintiff's position was messier, more emotional, but pointed toward a potentially greater injustice. Judge Brody listened, asked pointed questions, and took the matter under advisement. The months of waiting that followed were an agony of suspended animation for the players and a multi-million-dollar gamble for the lawyers funding the case. On November 9, 2012, Judge Brody issued her opinion. It was a split decision, a judicial Solomon's choice that gave something to both sides but ultimately ensured the battle would continue. She granted the NFL's motion to dismiss in part, agreeing that many of the plaintiffs' core negligence claims related to on-field injuries were indeed preempted by the labor agreement. This was a significant victory for the league. But then, she delivered the clause that kept the lawsuit alive. She denied the motion to dismiss the central allegation, fraudulent concealment. Judge Brody wrote that the plaintiffs had adequately alleged that the NFL had undertaken a concerted effort of deception and denial independent of its duties under the CBA. She ruled that if the NFL had fraudulently concealed the risks of brain injury from the players, preventing them from being able to make informed choices about their health, that was a separate wrong that could be adjudicated in her court. It was a narrow path forward, but it was a path. The doorway had not been slammed shut. It had been cracked open, just enough for the discovery process to begin. Discovery. In legal parlance, it is the pretrial phase where each side can compel the other to produce evidence. In practice, it is a trench war of documents, depositions, and subpoenas. For the plaintiffs, it was their shot at the Holy Grail, the NFL's internal files. They could now demand emails, memos, meeting minutes, and research reports from the league office and from the members of its mild traumatic brain injury committee. For the NFL, it was a perilous phase where their decades of private communications would be laid bare under oath and under penalty of perjury. The league fought fiercely over every request, asserting attorney-client privilege and work product doctrine, trying to shield as much as possible. But the plaintiffs, now armed with Judge Brody's ruling, had a legal mandate to dig. What began to emerge from this process were not yet the smoking gun memos that would later stun the public, but the first tangible signs of a systemic mindset. Deposition transcripts of former league doctors revealed a culture of dismissiveness. In one early deposition, a member of the MTBI committee was asked about the league's responsibility to players showing signs of dementia. His response, as quoted in subsequent filings, was chilling in its clinical detachment. The NFL is not in the business of diagnosing dementia. The plaintiff's attorneys began to assemble a timeline, showing how the league's public statements of safety consistently diverged from the private, more ambiguous discussions happening among its own advisors. They uncovered evidence that the league's research committee had, for years, rejected or ignored methodologies and findings from the broader scientific community that pointed to long-term risks. The early discovery phase served another critical purpose. It solidified the plaintiff's class. As word spread that the lawsuit had survived the NFL's first major assault, and that the discovery machine was starting to turn, more former players came forward. They were no longer just the tragic cases of the deceased. They were living men with early-onset Alzheimer's diagnoses, with crippling depression, with cognitive issues that destroyed their post-football careers. Each new plaintiff added weight to the claim, and each new story of decline added emotional resonance to the dry legal arguments. The case was metastasizing from a collection of individual grievances into a unified narrative of generational harm. The NFL, meanwhile, was being forced to transition from a strategy of pure dismissal to one of managed defense. They could no longer simply wish the case away. They had to prepare to defend their actions, in detail, under the glaring light of judicial scrutiny. The battlefield was now defined. The rules of engagement were set. And the first, most dangerous phase for the league, the excavation of its own history, was now underway. While the plaintiffs' lawyers were digging through the legal bedrock, it is crucial to understand the landscape they were excavating. For nearly 2 decades before the first lawsuit was ever filed, the National Football League had been waging a different kind of war, a propaganda war. Its objective was not to win in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, in the minds of players, and in the pages of medical literature. This campaign was not marked by overt villainy, but by a sophisticated, bureaucratic, and deeply effective strategy of doubt creation, message control, and scientific capture. At the heart of this effort was the league's own research body, the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee, formed in 1994 under the leadership of Dr. Elliot Pellman, a rheumatologist with no formal training in neurology or brain trauma, and later co-chaired by Dr. Ira Kassan, a neurologist who would become the league's most dogged defender. The creation of the MTBI committee was, in itself, a public relations masterstroke. It was a tangible, institutional response to a growing murmur of concern. The message was clear. The NFL takes this issue seriously. We are studying it. We are on top of it. The problem was the committee's output. Over the next decade and a half, it published a series of papers in the journal Neurosurgery, all of which arrived at conclusions remarkably favorable to the league's interests. These studies, which formed the backbone of the NFL's scientific defense, consistently downplayed the risks of concussions. One landmark 2003 study, based on a survey of team physicians, concluded that NFL players have evolved to a state where their ability to withstand brain trauma is advanced. Another study asserted that concussions in professional football are not serious injuries, and that players could be safely returned to play on the same day. The research methodology was repeatedly criticized by independent scientists. It relied heavily on data provided by team doctors who had a conflict of interest, used imprecise definitions, and often drew sweeping conclusions from limited datasets. Yet, because it was published in a peer-reviewed journal and bore the imprimatur of the NFL, it was granted a powerful legitimacy. This league-funded science became the gospel according to Park Avenue. It was disseminated to team doctors, trainers, and coaches. It was cited in press releases and background briefings with journalists. The talking points that flowed from it were clear and consistent, and they seeped into the very bloodstream of the sport. Concussions were part of the game. They were a short-term issue. Players could, and should, shake it off and get back in the huddle. The term ding was not just slang. It was a linguistic tool for minimization, implying a temporary, minor glitch rather than a traumatic brain injury. The league's safety videos shown to players featured stars casually discussing getting your bell rung and emphasized proper heads-up tackling technique, focusing on spinal safety while doing little to address the brain's vulnerability to internal sloshing and shearing. The underlying message was one of control. The risks were known, they were manageable, and the league was managing them. The subtext was even more powerful. To suggest otherwise was to question the fundamental nature of football itself, and by extension, to challenge the masculinity and toughness of the men who played it. The propaganda war was fought on multiple fronts. When independent researchers like Dr. Bennett Omalu or Dr. and McKee published findings linking football to CTE, the NFL's response was not to engage in scientific debate, but to deploy its institutional authority to discredit and marginalize. Dr. Casson became the league's public face of denial, appearing on television and in interviews to dismiss CTE as unproven, a myth, or the result of flawed science. He famously told HBO's Real Sports in 2007, "There is not enough valid, reliable, or objective scientific evidence at present to determine whether or not repeat head impacts in professional football result in long-term brain damage." This was not the rant of a fringe figure. This was the official position of the league's lead researcher, creating a powerful echo chamber of doubt. The strategy was borrowed directly from the playbooks of the tobacco and asbestos industries. Fund your own favorable science, attack unfavorable research, and above all, emphasize the lack of conclusive proof. The goal was not to win the scientific argument, but to prolong it indefinitely to keep the waters muddied. The impact of this campaign was profound and tragic. It directly influenced medical care on the sidelines. Team doctors, armed with the MTBI committee's findings, were more likely to clear concussed players to return. Coaches, absorbing the league's messaging, saw players with dings as assets to be encouraged, not patients to be protected. Most devastatingly, it shaped the players' own perception of their health. A young linebacker suffering from headaches and fogginess after a hit had been told, by the league's own videos and literature, that this was normal, temporary, and a sign of his commitment. He was embedded in a culture where admitting to symptoms could mean losing his starting job, being labeled soft by teammates and coaches, and jeopardizing his livelihood. The league's propaganda had internalized the risk, turning it from an external danger into an internal test of character. This cultural conditioning became a powerful silent ally for the league in the legal battles to come, as many players had been systematically taught to ignore and deny the very symptoms that were now the basis of their lawsuit. This decades-long campaign of denial and doubt creation is what gave the discovery process in the lawsuit its monumental significance. The plaintiffs were not merely alleging the NFL was negligent. They were alleging that the league's entire public-facing edifice, its research committee, its safety initiatives, its public statements, was a carefully constructed facade. The discovery phase was the process of pulling down that facade brick by brick, memo by memo, email by email, to see what was written on the inside. The propaganda war had bought the league time, perhaps 15 critical years. It had allowed the sport to grow exponentially in popularity and profit while deferring the day of reckoning. But it had also created a vast archive of internal communications that could, if revealed, prove the deceit. The league had been speaking out of both sides of its mouth for a generation. The lawsuit was now forcing it to choose which set of words would define its legacy. The public story was one of safety and vigilance. The internal story, hidden in filing cabinets and hard drives, was the one the plaintiffs' lawyers were now legally empowered to uncover. The two narratives were on a collision course, and the impact would be far more devastating than any hit on the field. Discovery in a lawsuit of this magnitude is not a single event, but a slow, grinding excavation. It is a process conducted in secure document rooms, through encrypted data transfers, and in depositions under oath. For the plaintiff's attorneys, it was a treasure hunt where the treasure was truth, and the map was a judge's order. They had survived the NFL's motion to dismiss on the fraudulent concealment claim, and now they had the legal right to demand the league's internal records. The NFL, employing the standard defense strategy of a powerful institution, resisted fiercely. They fought over the scope of requests, argued attorney-client privilege over vast swaths of communication, and produced documents in a slow, piecemeal fashion designed to frustrate and exhaust. But the plaintiffs, funded by their own deep pockets and driven by a mounting sense of outrage, were persistent. And slowly, from the depths of the League's archives, a damning counter-narrative began to emerge, one email, one memo, one deposition transcript at a time. The most explosive revelations came not from the League's main offices, but from the correspondence of the very body created to assure the public of its safety, the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee. The plaintiffs subpoenaed the emails and internal memos of its key members, particularly Dr. Ira Casson. What they found was a stark, often shocking, divergence from the committee's published, reassuring conclusions. In one pivotal series of emails from 2009, as public and congressional pressure was mounting, the committee members discussed the work of independent researchers. In a response to a colleague, Dr. Casson dismissed a study linking football to cognitive decline, writing, "This is all bogus. It's all fabricated." But it was his follow-up comment that cut to the heart of the plaintiff's case. He wrote, "I think we have enough data to be dangerous but not enough to be helpful. The problem is we don't have a definition of concussion that is workable." Here was the co-chair of the NFL's premier research committee, in a private communication, admitting the League's own science was inadequate and branding outside research bogus, even as the League was publicly citing that same committee's work as proof of safety and dismissing the independent studies. Other documents painted a picture of a committee more concerned with public relations than public health. Memos discussed strategy for getting our message out to counter negative press. There were discussions about how to frame the League's position to appear proactive without admitting liability. In one deposition, a former committee member was questioned about the League's decision to stop funding a long-term study of retired players being conducted at the University of Michigan. The study, which was beginning to show troubling cognitive trends, was defunded abruptly. When asked why, the witness testified that the League felt the researchers were not on the same page and were producing findings that were not helpful. The implication was clear. Research was only valuable to the NFL if it supported a predetermined conclusion of safety. Perhaps the single most damning piece of evidence, however, came from outside the committee, from the League's own film archives. The plaintiffs requested and received internal game footage from the 1990s and early 2000s that had been compiled for a different purpose: to study offensive and defensive techniques. As lawyers and paralegals sifted through hundreds of hours of tape, they found something the League never intended them to see. The films were often accompanied by written summaries, prepared by football operations staff. And in these summaries, the language was brutally, casually honest. A player staggering after a hit was described as woozy or shaken up. A player lying motionless was noted as having a concussion. This was the League's own internal acknowledgement, in real time, of the very injuries its public relations machine was simultaneously downplaying. The clinical, observational language of these film logs stood in direct contradiction to the public mantra that concussions were minor, ephemeral events. It was proof that within the League's own operations, the reality of brain trauma was understood and documented with clear-eyed clarity. The discovery process also unearthed painful inconsistencies in the testimony of League officials. In depositions, when confronted with the internal emails and memos, the confident public denials began to fray. The story shifted from, "There is no evidence," to "the science was evolving." The claim of prioritizing safety was met with internal budgets showing minuscule funding for independent neurology research compared to other League expenses. Each document was a thread, and as the plaintiffs pulled them, the fabric of the NFL's defense began to unravel. This was no longer a matter of conflicting scientific opinions. This was a pattern of evidence suggesting that the League's left hand knew what its right hand was publicly denying. The impact of this damning discovery on the lawsuit was transformative. It moved the case from the realm of tragic anecdote into the territory of provable corporate malfeasance. The plaintiff's core allegation of fraudulent concealment was no longer a theory. It was being corroborated by the NFL's own records. The emails and memos provided the state-of-mind evidence crucial to proving intent. They showed that key League figures privately harbored doubts, dismissed contrary science, and were focused on messaging while publicly presenting an image of confident certainty. This evidence fundamentally altered the balance of power in the negotiations. The NFL was no longer defending the abstract violence of football. It was now forced to defend its own words, its own internal communications, its own apparent deceit. The potential damages were no longer just about compensating for injuries. They could now include punitive damages designed to punish the league for its conduct. The discovery process had turned the plaintiff's lawyers from pursuers into prosecutors, and the NFL from a defendant into an institution whose own files were testifying against it. The fortress walls, built on public relations and legal maneuvering, had been breached from within. The true weight of the lawsuit was never carried by legal briefs or financial projections. It was carried in the faltering voices, the fragmented memories, and the quiet tears of the men and women who lived the consequences. While the battle over documents and jurisdiction played out in judges' chambers, a parallel, more visceral trial was taking place in deposition rooms across the country. Here, the human cost of the NFL's alleged concealment was given a name, a face, and a story. This was where the clinical term neurological injury met the chaotic, heartbreaking reality of lives dismantled piece by piece. The testimony of the former players and their families formed the emotional and moral core of the case, transforming abstract allegations of fraud into an undeniable record of suffering. The depositions of the players themselves were often exercises in profound frustration and sadness. These were men who had been conditioned to project strength, to exude control. Now they sat in sterile conference rooms under oath, struggling to recount the very details of their lives that the lawsuit demanded. A former running back, once known for his elusiveness and photographic memory of playbooks, could not remember the names of his children in order of birth. A linebacker, celebrated for his ferocious instincts, would lose his train of thought mid-sentence, his eyes clouding over as he grasped for a word that had vanished. The lawyers would ask a straightforward question about a specific game or injury, and the player would offer a vague, rambling anecdote about something else entirely, a sign of the brain's inability to sequence and retrieve information. The most poignant moments were not the outbursts of anger, though there were those, but the flashes of painful self-awareness. A former offensive lineman, after failing for several minutes to describe his daily routine, looked at his own lawyer with a look of utter defeat and whispered, "See, this is what I mean. It's all scrambled." In that moment, he was not a plaintiff. He was a man bearing witness to the erosion of his own mind. For every player struggling to articulate his decline, there was a spouse, a child, or a sibling who could chronicle it with devastating precision. The testimony of the family members was arguably more damning than any medical report. They spoke of the slow, insidious transformation of the man they loved. Wives described husbands who had become strangers, affectionate fathers turning into irritable, unpredictable figures prone to bouts of rage over minor inconveniences. They told of midnight wanderings, of pots left burning on stoves, of a once proud provider who could no longer hold a job or balance a checkbook. They spoke of the loneliness of caring for someone who was physically present but cognitively absent, of the grief of a loss that spanned years but lacked the closure of death. One widow, her voice steady but her hands trembling, described finding her husband, a former Pro Bowl safety, standing in their living room, crying because he could not figure out how to turn on the television. "He kept pointing the phone at it," she said. "He thought it was a remote. That was the moment I knew the man I married was gone." The children offered a different, equally devastating perspective. They spoke of fathers who missed graduations and weddings not out of neglect, but because the events were too overwhelming, the crowds too confusing. They recounted childhoods marked by fear, not of violence, but of the unpredictable mood swings and cognitive lapses of a parent they once saw as a superhero. A daughter of a former lineman testified about having to coach her father through the process of paying a bill over the phone, writing down simple instructions for him to read. "He was my dad," she said, her voice breaking. "He was supposed to teach me how to do things. Now I have to teach him how to be a person." These testimonies laid bare the collateral damage of brain trauma, the ripple effect that shattered families and altered generations. The psychological toll of the legal process itself on these plaintiffs was immense. For many, the deposition was the first time they had been forced to systematically recount their decline. It was an act of psychological excavation, dragging painful, often shameful, memories into the cold light of a legal proceeding. The NFL's defense attorneys, doing their job, would sometimes question the veracity of their memories, suggest alternative causes for their conditions like drug use or pre-existing conditions, or press them on inconsistencies in their stories, inconsistencies that were themselves symptoms of the disease. This adversarial environment could feel like a second victimization. One player's wife described the deposition as more brutal than watching him play. At least on the field, he chose to be there. In that room, he was just being taken apart again. Yet, there was also a cathartic power in this testimony. For families who had felt isolated in their private hell, the deposition room became a place where their experience was finally validated, recorded, and deemed legally significant. Their pain was being entered into the official record. Their stories were no longer private tragedies but evidence in a case against a multi-billion-dollar institution. This provided a fragile sense of purpose to their suffering. They were not just victims. They were witnesses. Their fractured narratives, their boxes of medical records, their home videos showing the stark contrast between then and now, all of it became part of the historical archive of the case. The human cost, once invisible and ignored, was now quantified in hours of testimony, in boxes of tissues, in the weary resolve of people who had nothing left to lose but their silence. Their words formed the heartbreaking human counterpoint to the cold, evasive language of the internal NFL memos. One set of documents spoke of strategy and messaging. The other spoke of lost birthdays, of forgotten names, of love strained to its breaking point. The lawsuit had become the arena where these two realities finally confronted each other, and the sheer, unbearable weight of the human testimony began to tilt the scales. For years, the NFL's posture had been one of impregnable certainty. They had dismissed the science, attacked the researchers, and framed the lawsuits as a money grab. But by 2012 and into 2013, the ground beneath that fortress began to shift in a way that could no longer be ignored. The pressure was no longer a single point of attack from a group of lawyers. It was a converging storm from multiple fronts, each feeding off the others, creating a crisis that threatened the league's most valuable asset, its public image. The damning discovery from the MTBI committee files was not staying in the deposition room. It was leaking into the public sphere, weaponized by a media that had grown skeptical of the league's steadfast denials. Major outlets like the New York Times, Frontline, and ESPN's Outside the Lines were no longer just reporting on tragic individual stories. They were now connecting them to the pattern of internal league documents that suggested knowledge and concealment. The narrative was hardening from "do football hits cause brain damage?" to "what did the NFL know, and when did they know it?" This media scrutiny reached a crescendo with congressional interest. While Congress had held hearings on football concussions as early as 2007, they had been relatively polite affairs. The new hearings, informed by the lawsuit's discoveries, took on a sharper, more prosecutorial tone. Lawmakers from both parties, facing constituents who were football fans and parents increasingly terrified by the headlines, demanded answers. They summoned NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell to testify. The spectacle of the most powerful man in sports being grilled under oath about internal memos and emails was a seismic shift in the power dynamic. Goodell's testimony was a masterclass in corporate caution. He expressed concern, emphasized the league's commitment to safety, and repeatedly fell back on the phrase, "the medical experts should decide." But the very fact that he was there, defending the league's past actions rather than proactively leading on safety, was a sign of weakness. Congress could not impose a settlement, but it could shine a Klieg light, and the image it projected was of a league on the defensive, its claims of benevolent stewardship fraying at the edges. Internally, the league's calculus was undergoing a painful and pragmatic reassessment. The legal team's initial strategy of total war, dismiss the case, crush the plaintiffs with cost and delay, was failing. Judge Brody had allowed the fraudulent concealment claim to proceed. The discovery process was a bleeding wound, with more damaging documents poised to become public. The financial threat was becoming quantifiable, and the numbers were terrifying. Actuaries for the plaintiffs were projecting future costs of care for thousands of retired players into the billions. A loss at trial, with the evidence of internal concealment now in play, could trigger punitive damages that would dwarf even those staggering sums. But the greater threat was existential. A public trial would be a nightmare. It would mean months of headlines featuring the harrowing testimony of broken players and their families, juxtaposed with the league's own dismissive internal emails. It would mean NFL executives and doctors being cross-examined on national television. The discovery had provided a roadmap for the plaintiffs to put the entire league on trial, not just for negligence, but for fraud. The brand, the shield, would be dragged through the mud daily. The financial cost of a loss was great, but the cost to the league's reputation and its relationship with fans, sponsors, and future players could be incalculable. This internal debate pitted the hardliners, who believed the league should fight to the bitter end and never admit fault, against the pragmatists, who saw a settlement as the only way to control the bleeding and ensure the league's long-term survival. The hardliners argued that settling was an admission of guilt that would open the floodgates to endless future litigation. The pragmatists countered that the floodgates were already open, and a settlement could actually cap the liability, create finality, and allow the league to move forward. They argued that the court of public opinion had already rendered a verdict. The NFL looked like it had hidden the truth. Continuing to fight in that environment was a losing proposition. The goal shifted from victory to containment. The question was no longer, can we win? But how do we make this go away in a manner that protects the business? The turning point, the moment the NFL truly began to seek an exit, is not found in a single memo but in the collective realization of this new reality. It was likely a series of confidential meetings in Park Avenue offices where lawyers laid out the grim discovery still to come, where public relations consultants showed polling data on eroding trust, where financial officers modeled doomsday scenarios. The league's outside counsel, having seen the plaintiff's evidence, would have had to deliver the unvarnished truth. They could win on some legal technicalities, but they could not prevent the story from being told in its most damaging form. The risk of a runaway jury in Philadelphia, sympathetic to the plaintiff's tragic stories and outraged by the league's internal communications, was too high. The NFL, an organization built on controlling the narrative, had lost control of this one. The discovery process had handed the plaintiffs the script, and it was a tragedy. The only way to stop the play from reaching its final, devastating act was to negotiate the curtain down. The reckoning was not an admission of moral failure, but a cold business decision. The existential threat to the game had to be neutralized, even if it meant writing the largest check in sports history. The battle was moving from the courtroom to the negotiating table, where the league would attempt to buy peace, but in doing so would validate the very war it had spent so long denying. The most critical phase of the lawsuit unfolded not in a public courtroom, but in a series of confidential meetings under the guidance of a court-appointed mediator, Judge Lane Phillips. These were not dramatic confrontations, but grueling, technical marathons where the future of thousands of men and the financial and reputational health of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise were reduced to spreadsheets, actuarial tables, and legal loopholes. The negotiations represented a fundamental clash of objectives. The NFL wanted finality, a cap on liability, and the absence of an admission of guilt. The plaintiffs' attorneys wanted maximum compensation for their clients and, for some, a lasting acknowledgement of the league's wrongdoing. The retired players themselves wanted relief, validation, and help. Reconciling these competing desires required a compromise that would leave no side fully satisfied, but would offer both a path out of a mutually destructive legal war. The numbers on the table were of a scale previously unimaginable in sports litigation. The plaintiffs' actuaries had built models projecting the cost of caring for the anticipated number of retired players with neurological disorders over the next 65 years. These models included diagnoses of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and dementia, and the costs of medical treatment, nursing care, and institutionalization. The figures were staggering, ranging into the billions. The NFL's own models, predictably, were far lower, but still represented a seismic financial hit. The negotiation became a battle over these projections, the prevalence rates of disease, the life expectancy of former players, the cost of future care. It was a macabre exercise, monetizing suffering and predicting the rate of cognitive decline for an entire population of men. Beyond the compensatory damages lay the specter of punitive of damages. If a jury found the league's conduct to be grossly negligent or fraudulent, they could award punitive damages meant to punish, which could multiply the total liability exponentially. This was the NFL's nightmare scenario, an open-ended financial judgment that could reach tens of billions. The league's primary goal became converting this terrifying unknown into a known, manageable number, a line item on a balance sheet. For the plaintiff's attorneys, the calculus was different but equally fraught. They were facing the classic dilemma of any plaintiff's lawyer in a class action: the certainty of a settlement versus the lottery of a trial. A trial promised the possibility of a larger total award and the cathartic public airing of the league's conduct. It also promised years of additional appeals, during which their aging and ailing clients would receive nothing. It risked a loss on a legal technicality, or a jury that, despite the evidence, sided with the cultural institution of the NFL. A settlement guaranteed money on the table, and relatively quickly. It would provide immediate help to men who were suffering now. But it would almost certainly mean the NFL would admit no wrongdoing. The league would pay, but it would not confess. This tension sparked fierce debates within the plaintiffs' legal consortium. Some attorneys, driven by a deep sense of injustice, pushed hard to take the case to trial, to force the league into the witness box and into a public reckoning. Others, more pragmatically, argued that their fiduciary duty was to secure the best possible outcome for their clients, and that a guaranteed multi-billion-dollar fund was a historic victory, admission or not. This fundamental compromise, money for absolution, became the bedrock of the deal. The NFL would fund an uncapped settlement, a monumental concession that acknowledged the scope of the problem. In return, the league would be released from all future liability related to concussion claims from the covered class of retired players. Most importantly, the settlement agreement would explicitly state that it was not an admission of liability. The NFL could, and would publicly frame the payout as care for our men, a benevolent gesture rather than a legal obligation. The plaintiffs would get compensation, but the official record would show no verdict, no finding of fraud, no judicial condemnation of the league's past actions. The truth of the internal documents would be buried under a mountain of cash, their legal significance extinguished by the settlement. For many players and families, this was a bitter pill. They wanted a verdict that said, "You did this." The settlement could only say, "We are paying for this." The negotiations were a tense tango around this core trade-off. The plaintiffs' lawyers fought to make the settlement fund as large and as accessible as possible, with low barriers of proof for the most severely affected players. The NFL fought to include stringent diagnostic criteria, to exclude certain conditions, and to create an appeals process to scrutinize claims. Every disease qualification, every monetary award tier, every administrative procedure was a point of contention, hammered out over months. The personal dynamics were equally complex. The mediator, Judge Phillips, had to navigate the egos and competing philosophies of the lead plaintiffs' attorneys, who were not used to sharing power, and the disciplined corporate unity of the NFL's legal team. The retired players, the supposed beneficiaries, were largely on the sidelines, their fates being decided by lawyers arguing over actuarial assumptions. The negotiation was a cold, clinical process that stood in stark contrast to the raw, human suffering that had initiated it. It was the business of resolving a mass tort, and in that business, closure often trumps catharsis. The deal that was slowly coalescing would end the legal battle, but it would also ensure that the full, ugly story of what the NFL knew and when it knew it would never receive a final, authoritative judgment from a court of law. Justice, it seemed, would be measured in dollars, not in truth. On August 29, 2013, the news broke with a figure that was deliberately designed to stun. The National Football League had agreed to pay $765 million to resolve the concussion claims of thousands of retired players. By the time it received final judicial approval in 2015, that figure had risen to an uncapped amount expected to exceed $1 billion over 65 years. The headlines wrote themselves, NFL to pay $1 billion in concussion settlement. It was a number that conveyed finality, magnitude, and a sense of historic reckoning. In press releases and orchestrated statements, both sides presented a narrative of closure. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell stated the settlement would provide help and support to our retired players who are in need, framing it as an act of benevolent stewardship, a fulfillment of the league's duty to its family. The lead plaintiff's attorneys, Christopher Seeger and Sol Weiss, hailed it as a historic agreement that would provide immediate relief and long-term benefits to the men they represented. The message from both camps was that a painful chapter was over. The reality, as with everything in this saga, was infinitely more complex and contested. Beneath the headline figure lay a labyrinthine 200-page settlement agreement, a document of breathtaking bureaucratic complexity. This was not a simple check to be handed to each former player. It was the creation of a new administrative universe with its own rules, its own gatekeepers, and its own steep burden of proof. The settlement established a grid of qualifying neurological conditions, each tied to a monetary award. The highest tier for deaths involving CTE diagnosed postmortem, or for conditions like ALS or Parkinson's, could pay up to $5 million. Lower tiers covered early and moderate dementia, with awards decreasing based on age and years of play. On its face, it seemed comprehensive, but the devil was in the diagnostic details. To receive an award, a retired player had to be examined by a court-approved neurologist or neuropsychologist and meet specific, narrow criteria outlined in the settlement. These criteria were often based on standardized testing benchmarks that some experts argued were ill-suited to detect the unique pattern of cognitive impairment caused by football-related trauma. The process placed the burden squarely on the ailing player and his family to navigate a medical and legal maze to prove they were sick enough, according to the settlement's strict definitions, to qualify. Almost immediately, criticism erupted from various quarters. Some neuroscientists and advocates for players argued that the settlement was strategically designed to limit payouts, not to provide comprehensive care. They pointed to the exclusion of common conditions reported by many former players, such as chronic depression, mood disorders, and cognitive issues that fell short of a full dementia diagnosis. The most glaring omission in the original agreement was the exclusion of living players with a CTE diagnosis. Since CTE could only be definitively diagnosed after death, this meant a player could be suffering devastating cognitive and behavioral symptoms linked to CTE, but if he was alive and his symptoms didn't perfectly match the criteria for Alzheimer's or dementia, he might receive nothing. This was seen by critics as a catastrophic flaw, a way for the NFL to sidestep compensation for the very disease at the heart of the controversy. The league had, in effect, settled around CTE rather than for it. Furthermore, the administrative structure itself drew fire. The settlement established a claims administrator and an appeals process overseen by a court-appointed special master. Critics feared this would become a fortress of denial, where claims would be endlessly scrutinized, appealed, and rejected on technicalities. The league had exchanged the risk of a jury trial for the controlled environment of a claims process it could influence through expert testimony and legal arguments over interpretation. The $1 billion figure, while staggering, was also potentially misleading. It was uncapped, meaning the NFL would pay all qualified claims. But if the qualification process was stringent enough, the ultimate payout could be far less than the projected billion. The league had bought predictability. It knew its maximum exposure was the sum of all qualified claims, which it could model and manage. It had escaped the existential threat of a jury adding punitive damages on top of an open-ended compensatory award. The early reaction from the player community was divided. Many, exhausted, sick, and in need of immediate financial help for medical bills, saw the settlement as a lifeline. It was money they might actually see, as opposed to a trial verdict a decade away. Others felt profoundly betrayed. They saw the settlement as a bargain basement deal that let the NFL off the hook without a true admission of guilt. The absence of that admission was a wound. For families who had lost fathers and husbands to suicide linked to CTE, a monetary award felt like blood money, a transaction that commodified their grief without acknowledging the cause. The $1 billion figure, meant to convey resolution, instead became a Rorschach test. To the league, it was the cost of doing business and moving on. To the plaintiff's lawyers, it was a victorious compensation package. To many players and advocates, it was a calculated payoff that prioritized the league's financial stability over full justice, a settlement that managed the crisis without truly solving it. The check was being written, but the story was far from over. The battle was simply shifting to a new, bureaucratic arena where the fight would be over each individual claim, each medical record, each interpretation of the fine print that now governed the aftermath of a lifetime of hits. The announcement of the billion-dollar settlement was framed as a unifying resolution, but in reality, it acted as a wedge, splitting the community of retired players into two distinct and often antagonistic camps. For every former athlete who saw the agreement as a necessary and timely rescue, there was another who viewed it as a profound capitulation, a betrayal of the very principles that had driven them to sue. These men, a minority but a vocal and passionate one, chose to exercise their legal right to opt out of the class action settlement. Their decision was not a rejection of compensation, but a rejection of the settlement's terms, its spirit, and its ultimate message. They chose the uncertain, arduous path of continuing their individual legal fights, believing that true justice demanded more than a check with no admission of fault. The arguments of the opt-outs were a concise indictment of the settlement's perceived shortcomings. First and foremost, they railed against the lack of an admission of guilt. For players like Sean Morey, a former Pro Bowl special teamer, and Alan Faneca, a Hall of Fame guard, this was non-negotiable. They had sued alleging the NFL knowingly concealed risks. A settlement that allowed the league to pay while explicitly denying liability felt like a moral defeat. It allowed the NFL to craft a narrative of benevolent care, washing away the allegations of deceit. "This wasn't about money for me," one opt-out player said privately. "It was about making them say they were wrong. The settlement lets them say they were right to fight, but generous to settle. It's a lie." Secondly, they attacked the settlement's treatment of CTE. The original agreement provided compensation only for players diagnosed with CTE after death. This meant a living player exhibiting the classic, devastating symptoms of the disease, memory loss, impulse control, depression, could not qualify for an award unless his symptoms fit another, narrowly defined neurological box. The opt-outs saw this as a fatal, almost cynical flaw. It meant the settlement failed to address the central medical terror of modern football for those still living with its consequences. Finally, the opt-outs argued the settlement let the league off the hook financially in the long term. While the fund was uncapped, they believed the restrictive qualification criteria and the bureaucratic claims process would effectively limit payouts well below the publicly touted billion-dollar figure. They feared the NFL had purchased global peace for a relative pittance when compared to its annual revenue, insulating itself from the true future cost of the epidemic it was accused of facilitating. By opting out, they preserved their right to sue the NFL individually, to seek damages that included punishment, and to force the league to defend its actions in open court. Their path was a gamble. They would forgo the guaranteed, if limited, payout from the settlement fund for the chance at a larger, more meaningful verdict, with the very real risk of getting nothing at all. The legal battles of the opt-outs became a scattered, complex frontier in the wider war. Some, like the family of the late Buffalo Bills fullback Cookie Gilchrist, filed wrongful death suits. Others, like a group led by former Chicago Bear Richard Dent, pursued their own consolidated litigation. These cases faced the same formidable legal defenses that the master lawsuit had overcome: motions to dismiss based on labor law preemption, challenges over jurisdiction, and the NFL's bottomless resources for delay. The opt-outs lacked the collective leverage of the class action. Their fights were lonely, expensive, and often demoralizing. Yet they served a critical purpose. They kept the legal pressure on the league in a way the settled class action could not. They were a lingering threat, a reminder that not all plaintiffs had been bought off, and that the underlying allegations of fraud could still be litigated. This divide sowed deep and painful tensions within the brotherhood of former players. The opt-outs sometimes viewed the settling players as having sacrificed principle for a quick payday, undercutting the fight for true accountability. "They took the money and ran," was a common, if privately held, sentiment. The settling players, many of whom were in dire financial and medical straits, often viewed the opt-outs as unrealistic idealists, jeopardizing immediate, tangible help for others in pursuit of a symbolic victory that might never come. Online forums and alumni gatherings became fraught with unspoken judgments. The shared suffering that had initially united them was now filtered through the prism of a strategic legal choice. The NFL's divide-and-conquer strategy, which had failed in the formation of the class action, had ironically succeeded in its dissolution. The players were no longer a unified plaintiff class, but a fractured group of recipients and resistors, their solidarity another casualty of the brain trauma they had all endured. The existence of the opt-outs also had a tangible impact on the settlement itself. Their continued litigation and vocal criticism kept media and judicial scrutiny on the agreement's flaws. This pressure contributed significantly to later amendments, most notably the 2020 revision that finally allowed living players with a diagnosis of CTE, via a prescribed biomarker test or future consensus diagnostic criteria, to qualify for compensation. This major concession was a direct response to the opt-outs' most potent criticism. They had, from the outside, fought to improve the deal for those on the inside. Their stubborn refusal to accept the initial terms made the settlement better, even as they themselves chose to remain outside its walls. Their journey underscored the uncomfortable truth of the resolution. The billion-dollar settlement was not the end of the story, but the creation of a new, fragmented landscape where the pursuit of justice would continue on parallel and often lonely tracks. The war was over for most, but for the opt-outs, the battle, with all its personal cost and uncertain reward, raged on. With the fanfare of the global settlement faded, the grim, grinding reality set in for the thousands of men and families it was meant to help. The billion-dollar fund existed, but accessing it required navigating a claims process of such Byzantine complexity that it became a new kind of battlefield. This was no longer a dramatic legal clash. It was a protracted administrative siege, fought in submission forms, medical reviews, and appeal letters. For the families of deceased players, often widows or adult children already burdened by grief and years of caregiving, the process felt like a second ordeal, a cold, bureaucratic interrogation of their loss. They were no longer plaintiffs in a heroic class action. They were supplicants before a system, tasked with proving their loved one's suffering met a rigid set of criteria defined in a 200-page legal document. The stories that emerged were profiles in exhaustion. A widow would spend months gathering a decade's worth of medical records, school reports showing a cognitive decline, testimonies from friends about personality changes, and the all-important post-mortem neuropathology report confirming CTE. She would submit a claim, only to have it rejected for a technicality. A form not signed in the correct place, a doctor's note missing a date, a specific cognitive test result from 15 years prior that was no longer in any file. The claims administrator, Brown Greer plc, tasked with processing the submissions, operated with a punctiliousness that felt cruel to grieving families. They would request additional, often invasive, documentation, divorce records to establish marital status, financial records, even personal diaries to corroborate timelines of behavioral change. For families, this felt less like a verification process and more like an invasion, forcing them to relive their most painful moments under a microscope to satisfy a distant auditor. The heart of the conflict lay in the diagnosis. The settlement's grid of qualifying diseases was specific, relying on standardized diagnostic manuals like the DSM-4. But the brain damage from football does not conform neatly to textbook categories. A player might have been diagnosed by his treating neurologist with major neurocognitive disorder due to traumatic brain injury, a condition that clearly stemmed from his career. Yet, the claims administrator might reject it because the specific testing scores or the doctor's clinical notes did not tick every box required for early dementia under the settlement's Appendix A. This led to a cottage industry of settlement doctors, neurologists approved by the court who understood the exacting requirements and could perform the battery of tests necessary to produce a qualifying diagnosis. This added another layer of cost and hassle for claimants, turning medical validation into a procedural hurdle. Ongoing legal disputes further snarled the process. The NFL and the class council, led by Christopher Seeger, found themselves in frequent, contentious court hearings before the overseeing judge, Anita Brody, and later Judge Wendy Beetlestone. The league would argue for a narrow interpretation of the settlement terms, seeking to exclude claims they felt were borderline or based on diagnoses that didn't meet the strict definitions. The class council would argue for a more expansive, compassionate reading. These battles were over commas, over the definitions of material change, over which versions of cognitive tests were admissible. For the families waiting, These abstract legal debates meant more delay, more uncertainty, more time spent in a purgatory between submission and resolution. The original lawsuit had been about concealment. The new struggle was about classification. This led to the widespread argument among critics and many frustrated claimants that the NFL had strategically exchanged one acute legal war for a perpetual, grinding administrative conflict. A trial would have been a public reckoning, but it would have had an end. The settlement created a forever process. The league, through its right to audit and appeal claims, could ensure that every award was fiercely contested, that the payout rate was managed, and that the ultimate financial cost was controlled. The goal, it seemed, was not to efficiently deliver compensation, but to administer it with such scrutiny that some claimants would give up, die waiting, or accept reduced awards through negotiation. The exhaustion was a feature, not a bug. The boundless resources of the NFL could be deployed not in a single courtroom, but across thousands of individual claim files, for decades. The men who had been broken by the game's relentless physicality were now being worn down by its legal and bureaucratic aftermath. The claims process became the final, ironic opponent. A slow, procedural game that demanded a clarity of mind and a persistence that the very injury being compensated for often made impossible. The settlement had promised relief, but for many, it delivered a new form of combat. One fought not with helmets and pads, but with paperwork and patience, where the opponent was no longer a linebacker, but a footnote in a master settlement agreement. The Concussion lawsuit and its staggering settlement did not settle the science. They detonated it. While the legal battle created a financial framework for dealing with the past, it simultaneously unleashed a tsunami of independent research that would definitively shape the understanding of football's future. The controversy acted as a massive funding and attention magnet, drawing top neuroscientists, neuropathologists, and public health researchers into a field that had been marginalized. The question was no longer whether there was a link between football and brain disease. The lawsuit had made that a public certainty, but rather how pervasive it was, how it worked, and who was most at risk. The settlement had closed a courtroom, but it opened 1,000 laboratories. The epicenter of this scientific revolution was the BUCTE Center, led by neuropathologist Dr. N. McKee. Building on the pioneering work of Bennett Omalu, McKee's team established a methodical, rigorous brain bank, studying the post-mortem tissue of deceased athletes. Their findings, published in high-impact journals like JAMA, were progressively more devastating. In 2017, they released a study that would become a cultural landmark. They had examined the brains of 202 former football players, from the NFL down to high school. The results were chilling. 177 of them, nearly 88%, were diagnosed with CTE. Of the 111 brains of former NFL players in the study, 110 were positive, a rate of 99%. The study had a clear selection bias. Families donated brains precisely because they suspected something was wrong, so it did not indicate that 99% of all NFL players would get CTE. But what it proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, was that the disease was not a rare anomaly. It was a prevalent, predictable outcome for a significant portion of those who played the game at its highest level. The images Dr. McKee presented were irrefutable. Healthy brain tissue versus the dark, tangled forests of tau protein in the brains of former stars. Science had provided visual evidence of the damage. This flood of research expanded beyond pathology. Longitudinal studies tracked living former players, showing higher rates of cognitive impairment, depression, and behavioral issues compared to the general population. Advanced imaging like MRI and PET scans began to identify potential biomarkers of damage in living brains. Research into subconcussive hits, the thousands of smaller, routine collisions that linemen endure in practice and games, suggested they might be even more culpable in driving CTE than the dramatic knockout concussions. The science was building a comprehensive model. Football exposed the brain to repeated traumatic forces, which triggered a pathological process involving tau protein, leading to neurodegeneration that manifested years later as dementia, mood disorders, and cognitive decline. The lawsuit had alleged the NFL concealed the risk. The new science was now meticulously mapping the risk itself, in horrifying detail. The NFL's relationship to this accelerating science was a slow, begrudging, and often clumsy retreat from total denial. The old guard, like Dr. Ira Kassan, was marginalized. The league began funding major independent research, including a long-term study at the National Institutes of Health, and publicly embraced a focus on health and safety. They implemented rule changes to reduce head-to-head contact and strengthened concussion protocols. But the league's official rhetoric remained carefully lawyered, avoiding direct causal statements that could be used against them in future litigation. This linguistic dance reached its farcical apex in a March 2016 congressional roundtable. When asked by Representative Jan Schakowsky, "Does football cause CTE?" Jeff Miller, the NFL's senior vice president for health and safety, after a long pause, replied, "The answer to that is certainly yes." It was a seismic, offhand admission, the first time a senior league official had publicly linked football and CTE in a causal way. The league immediately scrambled to clarify, stating Miller was referring to the research of Doctor and McKee specifically, not making a blanket statement. But the dam had cracked. The phrase "certainly yes" echoed through the media, a stark contrast to years of no conclusive evidence. This grudging acceptance marked the final collapse of the propaganda fortress. The NFL could no longer fight the science. It had to manage the fallout from it. The science had won. It had moved from the fringes, championed by outsiders like Omalu, to the mainstream, validated by institutions like Boston University and published in the world's most prestigious journals. The league's shift was not a moral awakening, but a necessary adaptation to an undeniable reality. The lawsuit had created the conditions for this scientific explosion by breaking the league's monopoly on the narrative and pouring billions of dollars of potential liability into the public consciousness. That consciousness, in turn, demanded answers that only rigorous science could provide. The answers that came back were unambiguous and terrifying. The legal battle had been about the past, what the league knew and hid. The scientific revolution was about the present and future, irrefutably demonstrating what the game does, and forcing everyone, from the commissioner's office to the living room of a family considering youth football, to confront the stakes with open eyes. The shadow that Mike Webster's brain had first cast was now a definitive, well-lit map of a dangerous country. The landscape of professional football in the years following the settlement is undeniably different from the one that existed when Mike Webster played. The lawsuit and the scientific revelations it catalyzed forced a visible, systemic response from the NFL. A walk through a game day in the modern era reveals a theater of risk management. Concussion protocols are now elaborate, publicized procedures. When a player stumbles or appears disoriented, he is escorted to a blue medical tent on the sideline. He must pass a battery of cognitive tests administered by an independent neurological consultant, not just a team doctor, before he can return. In the press box, certified athletic trainers serve as spotters, watching broadcast feeds for any signs of staggering or loss of coordination, empowered to call down and demand a player's removal. The rules themselves have been rewritten to penalize and eject players for hits that target the head or neck, for lowering the helmet to initiate contact. The language of the broadcast has changed. Analysts now immediately question a player's stability after a big hit, and discussions of protecting the shield have been replaced by talks of protecting the players. This shift extends beyond game day. The concept of load management, borrowed from the NBA, has crept into the NFL lexicon. Teams are more cautious with practice contact, often holding walkthroughs in pads. Preseason playing time for stars has been drastically reduced. Publicly, the league and its teams now emphasize a player's long-term health, celebrating those who choose to sit out with injuries. The old archetype of the player sneaking back onto the field with a shot of painkiller is now framed as a dangerous relic. The culture of overt, glorified toughness has been sanitized, replaced by a culture of cautious, publicized care. The NFL, it seems, has learned its lesson. The game has evolved. It is safer. But this narrative of progress contains a deep and troubling paradox. Is the game fundamentally safer, or has the league simply become brilliantly adept at managing the legal, financial, and public relations risk that the lawsuit so starkly exposed? The evidence suggests the latter. The changes are real, but they are largely mitigations, not solutions. The concussion protocol is a system for identifying and removing concussed players. It does nothing to prevent the concussions from happening in the first place. The rule changes punish the most egregious hits, but they cannot eliminate the foundational physics of the sport. A running back meeting a linebacker in the hole, a wide receiver stretching for a catch over the middle, an offensive lineman firing out of his stance. These essential acts of football still involve rapid acceleration, deceleration, and rotational forces that cause the brain to slosh and shear inside the skull. The helmet, redesigned repeatedly, is better at preventing skull fractures, but it is powerless against the internal trauma of the brain hitting the inner wall of the cranium. The league has gotten better at diagnosing the car crash. It has not invented a seatbelt for the brain. This leads to the most intractable problem: subconcussive hits. These are the routine, everyday collisions that do not rise to the level of a diagnosable concussion. For a lineman, this could be 60 to 70 such impacts in a single game, thousands over a season, tens of thousands over a career. The emerging science from Boston University and others strongly suggests that this repetitive, subconcussive trauma is the primary driver of CTE, the slow accumulation of damage that leads to degeneration decades later. No protocol can stop this. No rule change can eliminate it without dismantling the essence of line play. The modern NFL, with its faster, stronger athletes colliding with greater force, may actually be generating more subconcussive trauma than ever before, even as it publicly treats the more dramatic concussions with increased care. The game is being managed for the visible injury, while the invisible, incremental damage continues unabated. Thus, the haunting question persists: can football as a collision sport ever be truly safe for the human brain? The league's actions imply a belief that it can be made acceptably safe, a managed risk like driving a car. The science, however, increasingly suggests that the risk is inherent, like smoking. You can smoke filtered cigarettes, you can smoke less often, but the act itself carries a fundamental, irreducible danger. The NFL's post-lawsuit reforms are the equivalent of adding filters and health warnings. They make the product appear less hazardous, they manage the public perception of risk, and they provide a legal and PR defense. But they do not alter the core, dangerous mechanism. The culture has changed in its presentation, in its rhetoric, in its protocols. But beneath the blue tents and the independent spotters, the economic and cultural engine still runs on the same combustible fuel: controlled, spectacular violence. The league has not solved the problem identified in the lawsuit. It has professionalized the response to it, creating a sophisticated apparatus of care that functions alongside the unchanged reality of the game. The contradiction is now baked in: a public commitment to safety coexisting with a product whose appeal and financial viability still depend on the very thing that makes it unsafe. The legacy of the lawsuit and the science of CTE has created a profound generational schism within football itself. The men who sued, the Websters, the Waters, the Strzelczyks, belong to an era of willful ignorance, where the risks were hidden and the culture demanded silence. The men playing the game today operate in an era of stark, inescapable awareness. They have more information than any generation of football players in history. They have seen the documentaries, read the headlines about the settlement, and watched legends of the game deteriorate publicly. They enter the league knowing, with scientific certainty, that the career they are choosing could cost them their minds. This raises a pivotal question. Does this knowledge constitute empowerment, or does it simply frame the bargain in clearer, more horrifying terms? The perspective of the active player is a complex tapestry of acknowledgement, fatalism, and financial calculus. In interviews, many current stars speak openly about the risks. They talk about protecting themselves, about longevity, about life after football. They utilize the stricter protocols and are more likely to self-report symptoms. In this sense, they are empowered. They are not blind pawns. Yet, the fundamental bargain remains largely unchanged. The financial rewards have skyrocketed since the days of the plaintiffs. A first-round draft pick now signs a contract guaranteeing tens of millions of dollars before he ever takes a snap. For a young man from an economically disadvantaged background, this is not just a career. It is a once-in-a-universal lifetime opportunity to create generational wealth, to lift entire families out of poverty. The risk of cognitive decline 30 years in the future is abstract. The guarantee of life-altering money today is concrete. The player is making a more informed choice, but it is still a choice between a known, immediate, transformative benefit and a potential, distant, catastrophic cost. The player is making a more informed choice, but it is still a choice between a known, immediate, transformative benefit and a potential, distant, catastrophic cost. As one active lineman told me, "We all know, but what are you gonna do? This is the lottery ticket. You can't win if you don't play." This trickle-down effect is perhaps most starkly visible at the youth and college levels, where the financial reward is absent and the equation shifts dramatically. Participation in youth tackle football has been declining for over a decade, a trend directly attributed by surveys to parental concern over head injuries. The flag football movement, once a novelty, is now a powerful cultural and organizational force, endorsed by the NFL itself as a safer entry point. For parents, the decision to allow a child to play tackle football has become a moral dilemma. The science says the developing brain is more vulnerable to trauma, and that hits at a young age start the clock on the neurodegenerative process. The culture still celebrates the toughness and discipline of the sport. The lawsuit and its aftermath have placed that dilemma in sharp relief, forcing families to weigh tradition and character building against a potential neurological mortgage on their child's future. At the college level, the dynamic is even more fraught. The players are unpaid professionals in all but name, generating billions for their schools and the NCAA, assuming the same long-term risks as NFL players for no guaranteed financial security. They are the middle children of the crisis, old enough to understand the danger, but lacking the economic power of the pros to justify it. This leads to the core question the lawsuit leaves unanswered. Has it created a sustainable model for the future of football, or merely a more sophisticated one? The NFL's current approach appears to be one of sustainable management, not fundamental reform. The settlement provides financial recourse for the injured of the past. The new protocols and rules manage the visible crisis points. The promotion of flag football at the youth level helps insulate the professional league from criticism, suggesting a pipeline that is safer until the athletes are adults making informed choices for massive paychecks. It is a closed loop. The league addresses the symptoms, compensates the most visibly damaged, and protects the talent pipeline, all while preserving the violent essence of the product that drives the revenue. The players, armed with information, continue to choose the money, a choice the league can point to as validation of the risk-reward balance. But sustainability implies a system that can endure without causing irreversible harm. The science of subconcussive hits suggests the harm is still being caused, systematically and inevitably, to every player who steps on the field. The settlement was a backward-looking fix. The current protocols are present-tense risk mitigation. Neither addresses the forward-moving, accumulating pathology occurring in the brains of today's stars. The model is sophisticated because it has incorporated the language of care and the machinery of compensation. It is sustainable only as long as a sufficient number of incredibly talented young men continue to view the trade-off as worth it, and as long as the public can watch, entertained, while comfortably believing the problem is being managed. The generational divide is not just between past and present players. It is between the present and the future. Today's players are betting their future brains. The true cost of that wager, for them and for the sport, will come due in the 2040s and 2050s, when the MRI scans and cognitive tests of this generation tell the next chapter of the story. The lawsuit settled the past, but it did not secure the future. It merely gave everyone a clearer view of the cliff's edge, even as the game continues to run its thrilling, dangerous course along the precipice. Today, the concussion settlement is a living, breathing, and perpetually contentious entity. It is not a closed case, but an ongoing administration, a multi-billion-dollar corporation whose sole purpose is to process injury and loss. The uncapped nature of the fund, once hailed as a victory for players, is a double-edged reality. It means the NFL is legally obligated to pay every qualified claim in perpetuity. The final cost remains a looming unknown, a financial specter haunting the league's future balance sheets. As of early 2024, the league had paid out over $1.2 billion to more than 1,700 claimants, with awards averaging over $700,000. The claims continue to flow in, a steady drip of neurological tragedy converted into monetary awards. The fund is projected to pay out well over $2 billion before the 65-year term ends. This is not a one-time penalty. It is a permanent line item, a tribute the league must pay to its own history. The settlement agreement itself is a document in constant, grudging evolution. The infamous CTE loophole, which originally excluded living players, was amended in 2020 to allow compensation for those diagnosed via future, agreed-upon biomarkers. This was a monumental shift, forced by relentless criticism from opt-outs, advocates, and the presiding judges. Yet, even this amendment sparked new legal battles over what constitutes a valid biomarker, who qualifies, and what level of impairment is required. Similarly, disputes have raged over the qualifying criteria for dementia, with the NFL appealing awards they deem based on insufficient evidence, and class counsel fighting for broader interpretations. Every diagnosis, every award, exists in a state of potential challenge. The battlefield has simply moved from the question of "are they liable?" to the minutiae of "does claimant #4/937 meet the criteria in Appendix A, Section 3B? The war is now an endless series of bureaucratic skirmishes, fought in appeal hearings and federal court filings over the precise meaning of the peace treaty. This leads to the profound, unsettling, and ultimately unanswerable moral question at the heart of the entire endeavor. What is the monetary value of a stolen mind? The settlement assigns numbers, up to $5 million for a death with CTE, sliding scales for dementia. But these figures are arbitrary constructs of negotiation, based on actuarial projections of medical costs and lost income, not on the intrinsic value of a life derailed, of memories lost, of a personality erased. For a widow who spent 2 decades caring for a husband who no longer recognized her, a check for $3 million is both a lifeline and an insult. It provides financial security, but it also reduces a lifetime of love, struggle, and profound loss to a transaction. It compensates for the cost of care, but it cannot compensate for the loss of the person who needed that care. The settlement monetizes tragedy, but it cannot moralize it. Provides redress, but not redemption. It acknowledges the debt, but cannot restore what was borrowed. Time, clarity, and the simple ability to be oneself. The legacy of the lawsuit, therefore, is not found in a courtroom verdict, but in a permanent alteration of the NFL's reality. It did not bankrupt the league financially. The NFL is richer and more powerful than ever, but it inflicted a profound and permanent humiliation. It shattered the league's narrative of infallible stewardship. It proved that the mighty shield was not impervious. It could be cracked by the collective grief and rage of the men it had cast aside. The lawsuit dragged the league's internal contradictions into the light. The celebration of violence alongside the pretense of care. The pursuit of profit at the expense of the producers. It turned the NFL from a cultural icon into a corporate defendant. Its history forever shadowed by the words, fraudulent concealment. The settlement allowed the league to avoid a formal finding of guilt, but the court of public history has already rendered a judgment. The NFL knew, and it chose to look away. The lawsuit settled the legal claims of a generation, but it did not settle the soul of the game. That war continues on every field, in every doctor's office evaluating a claim, in every living room where a parent decides whether to let a child play, and in the brain of every active player who, with more knowledge than any predecessor, still chooses to step across the white lines. The battle over the past is administratively managed. The battle over the future, what the game is, what it does, and what we are willing to accept, rages on unresolved. The settlement was a monument built to contain the damage of yesterday. But the engine that caused the damage still runs today, faster and more profitably than ever, its fundamental mechanics unchanged. The money flows, the claims are processed, the protocols are followed, and the game goes on. A magnificent, problematic, and deeply American spectacle, forever marked by the billion-dollar shadow of its own denied truth. We began in silence, the silence after the roar, the private, lonely silence of a mind at war with itself. We end in a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of ignorance, but the heavy, complicated quiet of a reckoning that is both profound and incomplete. This has been the journey of the Concussion lawsuit, a voyage from silent suffering to legal eruption, through a storm of discovery and denial, to arrive at a costly, administrative, and deeply uneasy peace. It is the story of how the National Football League, an institution that sells controlled violence as the pinnacle of American entertainment, was forced to confront the uncontrolled, lifelong violence that entertainment inflicted on the bodies and brains of its employees. It is a uniquely American epic, fusing glory and greed, courage and concealment, brotherhood and betrayal. The central conflict exposed by this saga is as old as the Colosseum and as modern as a television contract. It is the tension between our celebration of spectacular, physical sacrifice and the biological reality of human fragility. We build myths around the warrior who plays through pain. We attach civic pride to the fortunes of men who destroy their knees and scramble their neurons for our amusement. The NFL did not create this appetite. It perfected the recipe for it, packaging violence with narrative and selling it as a weekly civic religion. The lawsuit was the moment when the ingredients were laid bare on the table, and one of them was poison. The conflict was never really about whether football was dangerous. It was about whether the architects of the game had a responsibility to be honest about the poison, and whether the price of our Sunday communion was being paid by someone else, in a currency of forgotten names and broken families. At its core, this is a story about power and the externalization of cost. The NFL is a corporate giant of breathtaking efficiency. So, we are left with reflective questions that now belong to all of us, not just the league or the players. Having seen the cost, having followed the trail from Mike Webster's truck to the autopsy room, from the damning internal emails to the heartbreaking depositions, from the staggering settlement figure to the agonizing claims process, what is your relationship to the spectacle? Can you watch the same way? Is the knowledge of the price a background hum you can tune out, or does it fundamentally alter the experience? And what would true accountability look like in a system where the game, for economic and cultural reasons, must go on? Would it require a radical reinvention of the sport's mechanics? A sharing of equity and governance with the players who bear the risk? Or is the current model, a violent game with a compensation fund for the ruined, the only realistic equilibrium for a society unwilling to give up its Sunday rituals? There are no easy answers, only the persistent, uncomfortable awareness. The lawsuit laid bare the transaction at the heart of the American football experience. We are the consumers. The players are the labor. The product is their physical sacrifice. For decades, the full cost of that product was hidden from the label. Now it is printed there, in the fine print of a settlement agreement and in the public testimony of broken men. We can choose to read it or ignore it, but we can no longer claim we do not know. We return, then, to the silence. But it is no longer an empty silence. It is now filled with the echoes of all we have heard. The thud of a hit, the crowd's roar, the frustrated stutter of a lost word, the determined voice of a widow, the cold legalese of a damning email, the gavel of a judge, and the relentless, ticking clock of a claims administrator. It is the silence of a retired player alone with his thoughts, or the lack thereof. For decades, it externalized the most devastating long-term cost of its business, the chronic, degenerative health consequences for players, onto the individuals themselves, their families, and the public healthcare system. The league harvested the prime years of these men, celebrated their sacrifice, and then discarded them when the harvesting was done, denying any causal link to the ruin that often followed. The lawsuit was the attempt, however imperfect, to internalize that cost, to force the league to pay the bill it had deferred for generations. The settlement is that bill now being paid with interest. It is a landmark demonstration that even the most powerful cultural institution can be forced, through the relentless pressure of law and public shame, to bear a portion of the true human expense of its operations. Yet, the system adapted. It internalized the financial cost while expertly managing the narrative, transforming a potential admission of guilt into a story of providing care. This is the bittersweet, perhaps inevitable, conclusion. The players who fought achieved a form of justice. They secured a fund that is providing real, tangible help to men who were drowning in medical debt and cognitive despair. They forced the league to acknowledge, through its wallet, the scale of the damage. They changed the conversation forever. But the justice they achieved was procedural, not transformative. It was compensation, not condemnation. The NFL machine did not break. It recalibrated. It incorporated the lawsuit into its ecosystem, treating the settlement payouts as a cost of goods sold, and the new safety protocols as risk management features of the product. The men who blew the whistle were compensated, but the whistle itself was muffled by the sheer, ongoing volume of the game. The spectacle continues, more popular and profitable than ever, now accompanied by a quiet, billion-dollar annuity for the wounded of the past. It is the silence of a family after the compensation check clears, the financial problem solved, but the emotional void permanent. It is the silence of the NFL, no longer denying the science, but forever changed by the legal and moral earthquake that forced it to stop. This is the complex, unresolved quiet that the game leaves in its wake. A silence purchased at great cost and one we all, in some way, now share.